I do not believe that the Bible teaches Jesus pre-existed in heaven with God, such that he was physically sent to earth to fulfill a mortal life before returning back to God. Neither do I believe that Jesus was or is an element of a triune God who came down from heaven to fulfill a symbolic role before returning to heaven again. Let me tell you what I, as a Bible student and a baptized Christadelphian, do believe. Please do consider subscribing if you haven't already, as this video is part of a wider series on similar topics. So the Bible tells us that Jesus was the Son of God, born to Mary, who was a human. Thus he is described throughout the scriptures as both the Son of God and the Son of Man. I've put a passage on the screen here from Luke chapter 1. We're looking at verses 35 and 36. Mary is told here that her miraculous conception will be by God's power, despite her being a virgin. And the angel mentions in the very next verse that Elizabeth, her cousin, has also conceived miraculously in her old age. That was a different type of miracle. It was because she was old, not because she was a virgin. But it's mentioned in the very next verse that there's another miraculous birth happening. So Jesus and John, both born miraculously. John the Baptist is then described as coming from God. If we look at John chapter 1 and verse 6, it says there was a man sent from God whose name was John. And there is no resultant argument to suggest that John the Baptist pre-existed in heaven with God, or that John forms part of a heavenly grouping of beings. It's well understood that this verse means that John's purpose was God-given. And yet, just a couple of chapters later, when the same thing is said of Jesus, verse 17, for example, God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. This is taken to be literal, that Jesus pre-existed in heaven before he was sent from heaven to the earth by God. Why is that? Well, there's a few other examples that I'm going to give you where similar language of things coming from heaven is generally accepted to be interpretive in the figurative sense, not the literal sense. So on the screen is a passage from the end of Matthew chapter 15 and the start of Matthew chapter 16, where Jesus is being asked by the Jews to show a sign from heaven to prove his credentials as the Messiah. Presumably they wanted to see a miracle like the miraculous feeding that had just occurred at the end of the previous chapter, through Jesus using God's power which had been given to him. They weren't asking him to show something to them that was normally kept physically in heaven. It was a sign using God's power from heaven. A second example would be that when challenged by the Jews in Mark chapter 11, Jesus asks them to consider whether they think John's baptism was from heaven or from men. And clearly in this context, he's asking them to think about whether they think John was doing God's will or not. He's not asking them whether John was using special holy water from a tank in heaven for these baptisms. That wasn't what they meant when they said from heaven. In James's epistle seems to paraphrase much of the Sermon on the Mount that you can read about in Matthew chapters 5 through to chapter 7. And in James's epistle, in chapter 1, verse 17, he states that every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth. And this is in contrast to temptations, which James says in verse 14 at the top of the screen, that the temptations come from within us due to our own sinful human nature. And that's backed up by the prophet Jeremiah and also in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 19. But looking at the context of the original word spoken by Jesus during the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7, I've put it on the screen here, we can see that this provision refers to God's response to our prayers to him. Again, not physical provision of something stored in heaven, but instead it describes God's action in response to our supplication. A fourth example. In John chapter 6, Jesus is likened to the manna that came from God. In Exodus chapter 16, we see that the manna miraculously appeared with the morning dew in the morning. It was a provision from God. There's no suggestion here that there's a warehouse full of manna in heaven and God opted to send a few scoops down each morning for the ungrateful Israelites to enjoy. No, the manna itself wasn't physically sent from heaven. It was provided by God who is in heaven. And so too Jesus was the man provided by God to give a hope of life, a hope of salvation to the world. And the fifth example, in Romans chapter 11, it states that all things come from God, for of him and through him and to him are all things. We understand that God is the ultimate creator of all things. It's by his will that they exist. But we don't infer that God has a stock of fresh flowers or zebras or coal in heaven that he uses to occasionally replenish the earth. Instead, we understand that this refers to God's creative power and sovereign will, which means that God is able to provide as he sees fit. And it's worth mentioning as well that in all of these examples, God is elevated above the things that are being miraculously provided. God is above all, including Jesus. So in essence then, I think there are two factors to consider on this topic. Number one, in the same way that John and the manna were miraculous provisions from God, so too the existence of Jesus was a miraculous provision of God. And number two, as Jesus set his mind on heavenly things, that is to say, the will of his Father, in contrast to his own will, we see that battle played out in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's his will against God's will, and he's trying to follow God's will. His thinking as a result of trying to follow God's will is from heaven. It's not focused on the things of the earth. And in this context, then, we can read passages like John chapter 16, where it says, I came forth from the Father. Jesus was a miraculous provision from God. He was God's Son. I have come into the world. I mean, this is a phrase that we use today still to describe babies being born. It describes the start point of a life, a state of consciousness. It doesn't infer that they've come from somewhere else. I leave the world to go to the Father. This is the element where Jesus perhaps begins to speak plainly to his disciples. He will literally ascend to heaven to be with his Father. John chapter 8, again, we can read this in this context. He says, you are from beneath, I am from above. You are of this world, I am not of this world. Jesus' thinking here is heavenly. He does not sin. He instead does the will of his Father who is in heaven. And the disciples, in contrast to that, are of this world. They are mortal, sinful human beings, as we are today. And subsequent references in this passage in John chapter 8 to being sent from God have no inference of a pre-existence with God, but merely a purpose from God, the same as John the Baptist had. And Jesus picks up on this same theme in John chapter 17. His disciples, now baptized, are no longer to have minds of the world, but have been sent into the world as you, God, have sent me into the world. In the same way that I've been sent into the world, these disciples have been sent into the world. Now, if Jesus was sent from heaven literally into the world, then that would infer that his disciples had to be stored in heaven as well before they could be sent into the world. It doesn't make sense. The sending here is clearly linked to purpose, not to something involving physical movement from heaven to earth. And in John chapter 1, we've already been to verse 6, but let's just reread the first few verses. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. So this word here is describing God's creative power and God's will. And then in verse 14, it describes Jesus as the Word became flesh. Jesus was the man who did God's will perfectly in a way that no other flesh has been able to fulfill. And John chapter 17 then picks up on this same theme again, referring to Jesus as the Word made flesh who has perfectly fulfilled God's will, enabling him to be praised in a way that has not been possible since the creation of the world and man's introduction of sin through the misuse of free will. And again, there's that reference to Jesus being sent in the same way that in John chapter 1, John was sent. Now, I'm interested to hear what you have to think about this. There are more examples. John's Gospel in particular is full of them. So John chapter 3 is a passage talking figuratively about rebirth and the difference between heavenly and earthly mindsets. John chapter 6 is where Jesus introduces this idea figuratively of eating his body and drinking his blood, and is even given in the context that people plainly knew who Jesus was. They knew who Mary was, his mother. He was a mortal human from a human family. And in both of these passages, Jesus describes himself as having come from God or from heaven, or having been sent by God. And in the context of the passages where literal physical things like childbirth or eating and drinking are used to describe something figuratively, it makes sense that these are figurative references that refer to Jesus' God-given purpose. I think it's no coincidence that the Gospel of John, which is where you'll find most of these passages that describe Jesus coming from God or coming from heaven, it starts with a description of John the Baptist being sent from God. That's one of the first things we looked at. And this immediately gives that essential figurative context to the usage of similar language throughout the book, throughout the Gospel, which helps us to understand the meaning of these passages. I've just repeated the summary on the screen there for you. This is what I think really helps us to explore this topic, that Jesus was sent from heaven. In the same way that John and the Manna were miraculous provisions from God, so too the existence of Jesus was a miraculous provision of God. And also that Jesus set his mind on heavenly things. His thinking was from heaven. He was not thinking in earthly terms. Now, as I said, I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on this perspective in the comments. And if you haven't already, please do like this video and subscribe to the channel to be notified whenever we release another video. Thank you for listening.